This is going to be a short video, and I'm mainly doing it because I have a question for you guys, and I'm really, really curious to see what you have to say about it. I'm going to ask the question at the end of the video. Now, as I mentioned in my previous episode, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. Life under socialism in my country was quite difficult. You see, the great dear leader wanted to pay off all the nation's debt, and Romania was the only nation in the world that managed to pay off its debt entirely to the IMF. And because of that, there was a lot of austerity measures, there was a lot of shortages, and you couldn't buy whatever you wanted unless you had a ration. For example, you could only buy 1 kilogram of meat per month, you could only buy 1 bottle of cooking oil per month. Almost everything was on the ration. And the press, instead of focusing on the problem, which was the government, it inspired hatred between the population. So it's your neighbor's fault for being greedy and taking more than what he needs, and it's your neighbor's fault that there are shortages because the government is kind and the government is generous and the government has experts in charge which make sure that there is enough to reach for everyone. However, it's the people that currently steal, it's the people that take more than they need, and those are the real problems. So it's not the government, it's your neighbor. Now, with that said, with understanding the context, it's also interesting to understand why people hoarded. Because I have seen American communists and Western bourgeoisie twats blaming the problem for the shortages because people were hoarding, right? So they're using the state party propaganda that was in effect during that time, and they're literally blaming the people for hoarding. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you why people would hoard. So let's say your car battery broke down, and you go to a mechanic, and he tells you that there is no way you can buy a new one. Like, he's not going to take your money in order to buy a new car battery. And you can go to as many mechanics as you want. You're literally not going to be able to find a car battery anywhere. But then maybe you get to a mechanic who says that he might manage to get you a car battery if you help him out with a problem. You see, his daughter is getting married and he doesn't have alcohol for the guests. So if you can bring him some alcohol, then he's going to give you a car battery. Now, alcohol is on the ration, so even though you have the money to buy alcohol, you can't buy it from anywhere. And because you are a drinker, you probably drank your ration of alcohol. So now you need to find someone that can have alcohol. And maybe you know someone which is not a drinker, but he was hoarding alcohol and he was keeping it aside in case he's going to ever need a favor. Now, maybe his wife is a really good baker and she uses flour, but because you're not married, you don't bake, but you have the flour because you bought the flour in the past just for this particular event, if it ever comes up. So now you're going to give the flour, who's going to give you the alcohol, and you're going to take the alcohol and give it to the mechanic, who now is going to install a brand new battery in your car. Maybe he's going to throw in some extra cables. Job well done. Of course, you're going to also have to pay him. So during communism, usually there were 3 goods that were better than actual money. Like, money almost had no value, but what did have value was coffee, whiskey, and Camel cigarettes. And you usually would have these consumables that you wouldn't use yourself, but you would exchange for favors. And you would also hoard things that were on a ration, even though you didn't use, also to exchange for favors. So flour was a great example. If you didn't bake, if you didn't need flour, you'd still buy it just in case. People would also hoard water. I know like everyone had in their house at least a bucket filled with water, just in the case that there's a water shortage and you need to mop the floors, or you need it for cooking or whatever. You know, like people would have water in their houses stocked. People would have oil in their houses stocked, like random things. People that have children could afford to get more things because even though you had a ration, you still had to wait for 2 or 3 hours in a queue. Sometimes you had to wait it during very warm summers that were very difficult to bear. Other times you had to wait it during very cold winters that were also difficult to bear, and you had to stay for 2 to 3 hours. Now, people who had children could get their kids to stay in line, and if you had many children, you could actually send them in different places across town so you can hoard more. People who worked in factories, like in a meat factory or at a farm, they could manage to steal, mix some of the goods there, and they would use the goods in order to exchange for favors or to exchange for other products that they would also exchange for favors. Okay, so now the question is, okay, so my question to the Western audience is, can you wrap your mind around such a system? Like, can you believe that people actually live like this? It's a genuine question. I'm really curious. Like, do you think this is a horror story, or this is something that has happened? And more importantly, do you think it can happen in the future? And if you think it can't happen in the future, the question is why? Why do you think Romania was different? Or like, do you think like the genetics of the people here was different? Do you think people enjoyed living in this shit? Do you think that people were happy like this? Like, what exactly do you think that is particular to Eastern Europe that can't be reproduced anywhere else in the world? And to answer the question myself, I don't know what you guys have to say, but to answer the question myself, is due to the fact that a lot of people were actually supporting the government. Like, for example, a person that worked at a meat factory and had a really good life because of that, maybe they could snitch on their neighbors a little bit, maybe they really bought into the government propaganda and believed all the lies. Like, that person was supporting of the government, and that person was a danger to the people around them. Why? Because they would snitch. So if, for example, you would complain that the bread lines are too long, if you complain that you can't get access to basic goods, well, that person would snitch on you. What would happen? Well, you'd probably lose your job. A lot of people believe that the punishment for criticizing the regime was prison. And the reality was that that was only reserved for like really problematic people. But most individuals, they would just lose their job, or they would not get promoted. And I guess there was also the use of medical tyranny. I should make another video where I talk about how the entire profession of psychiatry was actually used by the government in order to punish dissidents. So you have punitive psychiatry, which had nothing to do with medical issues or trying to help people, but it was instead an arm that would make sure that the people who were problematic to the government, like writers and journalists, they would be considered crazy, and the government would consider them harmful for the people around them. So they would take them and put them into a mental institute from which they would never come out again. And if you happen to read their book, or if you happen to read their writings, then people will say, why are you reading the writings of a crazy person? Like, do you want to get crazy as well? And you got to understand, these were actual doctors who finished med school, who took the oath to do no harm, and they were operating under the command of the government, and none of them would step out of line. None of them would talk about the abuses that they were seeing. They were very aware that many of the patients that came into their clinic were healthy people, but because they were a problem to the political regime, the government didn't want to give them the right of a trial. They didn't want to give them the right to be able to get out of prison after serving their time. So instead, they would be locked into a mental institute. Now, all of this is documented. Like, I'm not conspiracy. Like, all of this has happened. We have paperwork that proves that this has happened. So again, like, my question is, like, all these people in the West who love this system, what makes you think like it can't happen again? What makes you think that it can't happen in the West? That is my question. Like, what exactly, what apparat, why is the reason, what is the Rubicon that you would say, well, this can never happen here? And I'm really curious to see what you guys have to say in the comment section, and I'll see you all there.